It's nice to have you here. I am Joshua, and this is The Last Hike. In this video, join me as I go through the stories of the worst hiking accidents ever recorded, from two women who ignored every warning during a brutal Half-Dome heatwave, to a solo climber whose determination carried her all the way to the cables before her body began to fail. It was the 6th of July 2019, and the Happy Isles trailhead in Yosemite National Park was already busy by 6 a.m., despite a heat advisory that had been in effect since Thursday. The forecast high for Yosemite Valley that day was 108 degrees Fahrenheit. At elevation on the exposed granite sections of the trail, where the rock absorbs direct sun for hours, surface temperatures would climb past 140 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. Half Dome is one of the most iconic hikes in the United States, a roughly 1.6-mile round trip with nearly 5,000 feet of elevation gain that ends with a steep cable-assisted climb up a granite face so exposed that Park Service posts explicit warnings about the dangers of the final ascent. The cables themselves are metal poles drilled into the rock with steel cables strung between them. The last 400 feet of the hike requires pulling yourself up a granite slope that pitches roughly 40 to 45 degrees, with nothing but those cables and your grip strength between you and a fall that would end everything. In summer heat, the steel cables absorb solar radiation all day, and by afternoon the metal surface can exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to blister skin on contact. Since 2010, the park has required permits for the cable section because overcrowding was creating dangerous conditions, limiting access to approximately 225 day hikers plus permitted backpackers. Every permit comes with safety information about weather, heat exposure, and the physical demands of the hike, which is basically the park telling you how this can go wrong. Gretchen Landis was 49 years old and lived in a suburb outside of Phoenix. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and had spent the previous 18 months building what she described to friends as her outdoors phase. This basically included a handful of moderate day hikes around Sedona and Camelback Mountain, a guided walk along the Grand Canyon's south rim, and a growing Instagram account where she posted trail selfies with captions about finding herself in nature. The photos were polished, the gear was expensive, and the trails were all manageable for anyone in average shape. She had accumulated roughly 4,000 followers, mostly friends, coworkers, and women in similar demographics. The identity felt real to Gretchen, because honestly, nobody in her audience had the experience to tell her it wasn't. The trails Gretchen was used to in Phoenix were hot, but they were also short, well-maintained, and never more than a 15-minute drive from an air-conditioned car. If something went wrong, you could call for help, and someone would reach you within the hour. Half Dome was 16 miles in a granite canyon, with no cell service above Nevada Fall, no vehicle access, and no quick way out once you pass the halfway point. The heat was comparable, but the infrastructure was not. Her friend Tammy Salcedo was 47 and lived in the same development. Tammy was less fit than Gretchen and less interested in the outdoors brand Gretchen was building, but she had been pulled into the orbit of Gretchen's enthusiasm over the previous year. They had hiked Camelback together twice. Tammy found both experiences difficult but manageable, though she privately told her husband after the second one that she genuinely didn't understand why Gretchen treated it like a major accomplishment. She trusted Gretchen's assessment that the progression from Camelback to Half Dome was reasonable because Gretchen said it with the confidence of someone who had done the research. She had not done the research. It pretty much wasn't. Camelback Mountain is a 2.5-mile round trip with 1,300 feet of elevation gain. Half Dome is over 6 times longer with nearly 4 times the elevation. The comparison was kind of like running a 5K and deciding you were ready for a marathon. What gets me about these two right from the start is Gretchen had basically built this whole identity around being outdoorsy without ever testing it against anything that could push back. Half Dome was kind of the first trail in her life that was gonna have an opinion about whether she belonged there or not. That was going to have an opinion about whether she belonged there? The trip was planned primarily around content. Gretchen had told her followers she was attempting Half Dome and framed it as her biggest challenge yet. She had bought new hiking boots like 2 weeks before the trip and broken them in on a single 3-mile walk around her neighborhood. She packed a 2 0-ounce water bottle and a second one she planned to fill at the trailhead. For a 1.6-mile hike in July in Yosemite during a heat advisory, experienced hikers recommend a minimum of 1 gallon per person, roughly 128 ounces. Gretchen had roughly 40. Neither woman brought electrolyte supplements, sun protection beyond a baseball cap, or lightweight gloves for the cables. Tammy's preparation was similar. She brought 2 small water bottles, a granola bar, a banana, and wore trail running shoes she had purchased for their appearance rather than their traction. Neither woman brought a first aid kit or any form of water filtration for refilling along the trail. Neither had studied the route beyond looking at photos of the cable section on Instagram. There was also the matter of the permit. Half Dome cable permits are distributed through a lottery system months in advance and are limited to a few hundred permitted hikers per day. Gretchen and Tammy did not have permits. Gretchen had applied for the daily lottery twice, been rejected both times, and decided that the permit system was what she described to Tammy in a text as basically just a suggestion. Her plan was to basically hike to the subdome and talk her way past whoever was stationed there, or just wait until the ranger was busy and go around.
I'm not gonna sugarcoat this one. The permanent system exists because people literally died on that route when it got overcrowded. Treating it like something you can just charm your way past is genuinely one of the most dangerous attitudes you can bring onto a trail like this.
They arrived at the trailhead at approximately 9:40 a.m., roughly 3 to 4 hours later than most experienced Half Dome hikers begin. The standard advice is to start before dawn and be off the exposed sections before the heat of the day. Because in summer, Yosemite's granite absorbs solar energy from the moment the sun clears the valley walls, and by afternoon, the rock becomes a radiator that cooks a person from below while the sun cooks them from above. During heat advisories, rangers treat this advice less like a recommendation and more like the difference between hiking and heat stroke. They had trouble finding parking in the valley and ended up taking the shuttle to the trailhead, pushing their actual start to closer to 10 a.m. A ranger at the trailhead spoke with several groups that morning about the heat advisory. She later stated she had an interaction with 2 women matching Gretchen and Tammy's description, in which she warned about the dangerous heat and told them they needed significantly more water. The response, according to the ranger, was dismissive. One of the women said something along the lines of them being from Phoenix, so they were used to the heat.
Phoenix heat and Half Dome heat are not the same thing, and honestly the fact that I have to say that out loud tells you everything about how Gretchen processed risk.
The trail to Half Dome via the Mist Trail passes Vernal Fall and then Nevada Fall, climbing steep granite steps physically demanding even for fit hikers. Gretchen and Tammy moved slowly from the start. Their pace, later estimated by investigators from photographs, social media timestamps, and witness accounts, averaged roughly 1.5 miles per hour on flat sections and significantly less on steep terrain. For reference, the average hiking pace on moderate terrain is 2 to 3 miles per hour, so they were pretty much behind from the start. The thing about the Half Dome trail that most visitors never account for is the heat shift. The Mist Trail has shade and spray from the waterfalls, so the first couple miles feel cooler than conditions actually are. But once you pass Nevada Fall, the tree cover thins and the trail crosses long stretches of exposed granite that has been absorbing direct sunlight since dawn. By afternoon, those surfaces can exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The rock radiates heat upward through boot soles, and the dry air pulls moisture off skin so fast that rangers call it invisible sweating, where a hiker can lose over a quart of fluid per hour without ever feeling wet. What neither of them understood was that their bodies had been losing fluid at a dangerous rate since the moment they left the shade of the Mist Trail. By the time a person feels thirsty in extreme heat, the deficit is already significant, sometimes a full quart behind what the body needs to function safely. Dizziness, confusion, and impaired judgment follow, which means the worse the dehydration gets, the less capable you become of recognizing how bad it actually is. By noon, they had reached the top of Nevada Fall, roughly 3.5 miles in and about 2,000 feet up. The shade from the Mist Trail Canyon was behind them now, and the sun was directly overhead, reflecting off every exposed granite surface in every direction. They were already showing signs of strain. Tammy's face was deeply flushed and she was sweating heavily. Her breathing labored in a way that several passing hikers noticed. Gretchen appeared more composed, but was visibly struggling with the heat, her shirt soaked through. They rested at the top of Nevada Fall for roughly 30 minutes, during which Gretchen took several photos and posted one to her Instagram story. Tammy told Gretchen during the rest that she thought they should turn around. She said her feet were burning through her shoes, she was dizzy, and the distance remaining felt like more than she could handle. Gretchen told her the hardest part was already behind them and that the rest of the trail was mostly flat, which was not accurate. Tammy did not push further. They had consumed nearly all their water by this point. The 60-odd ounces they had carried between them was almost gone after 3.5 miles of steep terrain in extreme heat. The return trip would cover the same ground with the cable section and over 4 additional miles still ahead of them. Tammy mentioned being thirsty, and Gretchen told her they could fill up further along the trail. There are no reliable water sources between Nevada Fall and the summit that are safe to drink without filtration, which neither of them carried.
Honestly, the water thing alone, like that should have been the end of the hike right there. Even if literally everything else went perfectly, they were already in a deficit that was only going to get worse in that kind of heat, and neither of them seemed to register that at all.
The section between Nevada Fall and the Subdome approach is roughly 3.5 miles of trail through thinning forest and across exposed granite slabs. It is less steep than the Mist Trail, but deceptively long and brutally exposed, with scattered tree cover that provides seconds of shade before opening back onto granite storing heat since dawn. Gretchen and Tammy moved through it slowly, stopping frequently. Tammy was limping slightly by 1 p.m. A hot spot on her right heel had turned into a blister she was trying to ignore.
Tammy's body had been telling her to stop since Nevada Fall. I genuinely think she knew this was the wrong way before the cables.
Gretchen's knees were visibly bothering her on downhill sections. The air temperature at this elevation was in the low 90°F, but on the exposed granite slabs where there was no shade for hundreds of yards at a time, the heat radiating off the rock surface added another 15 to 20 degrees to what their bodies were actually experiencing. Without adequate water, the cumulative effect of heat, exertion, and invisible fluid loss was shutting down their ability to cool themselves. Multiple hikers who were descending from the Subdome that afternoon passed Gretchen and Tammy on the trail. At least 3 of these hikers later gave statements to park investigators. One couple from Colorado described stopping to talk to the 2 women sometime shortly after 1 p.m. and telling them directly that they needed to turn around because of the heat. The husband said the shorter woman, matching Tammy, was barely sweating despite the temperature and looked visibly unwell. Her skin flushed a deep red color that concerned him. He offered them water from his own supply. The taller woman, matching Gretchen's description, declined and said they were from Phoenix and knew how to handle heat. She said people exaggerated Half Dome all the time. The wife said the shorter woman looked like she wanted to accept the water but said nothing. A solo hiker from the Bay Area encountered them around 1:45 p.m. on the approach to the Subdome and described a similar exchange. He told them the cables would be dangerous in this heat because the metal gets hot enough to burn bare hands, and the exposed granite offers zero shade for the entire 400-foot climb. He said, the taller woman told him she didn't need hiking advice from a stranger and kept walking. Every single person who talked to them on that trail tried to help, and every single one got either dismissed or flat out insulted. I keep coming back to that because the trail was basically full of people handing them the information that could have saved their lives, and they treated it like bad customer service reviews. The Subdome approach is a steep scramble up granite slabs that have been baking in direct afternoon sun for hours, hot enough that hikers in previous summers reported burning their palms on the rock surface during the scramble. It takes most hikers 20 to 30 minutes. Gretchen and Tammy reached the base of the Subdome at approximately 2:45 p.m. When Gretchen and Tammy reached the permit checkpoint, a wilderness ranger conducting permit enforcement that afternoon asked for their permits. Gretchen told him they had applied but didn't receive them and asked if they could go through anyway since they had come so far. The ranger told them no, permits were required and the conditions were too dangerous. He pointed out that they appeared to have no water remaining and that the cable section in this heat with no hydration was life-threatening. He told them he had already turned back 6 groups that afternoon because of the heat advisory. Gretchen argued. She told the ranger they had been hiking all day and deserved to at least see the cables, asked to speak to someone else, asked if there was an exception process. The ranger maintained his position. He told them the cables were not safe in their current condition, that the steel was hot enough to cause burns, and that both of them showed visible signs of heat exhaustion.
I need to be careful here because the ranger genuinely did his job. He told them no, and what Gretchen did after that was entirely on her.
At approximately 3:05 p.m., the 2 women left the checkpoint area. The ranger assumed they were beginning their descent. Instead, they left the established route and crossed exposed granite terrain to reach the cable route, a scramble that was steep, unprotected, and hot enough to feel through their shoes. The ranger did not see them access the cables because he was engaged with another group.
This is the moment that gets me because up until now, you could argue they were just unprepared. After the bypass, they were making a choice.
Gretchen and Tammy reached the base of the cables at approximately 3:15 p.m. The cable route was completely deserted. The steel cables had been absorbing direct sunlight for nearly 10 hours, and the metal was radiating heat. A hiker resting in what little shade existed near the base later told investigators he had shouted to them that the cables would burn their hands without gloves. The reality was that the cables were empty because basically everyone who understood the mountain had already left. The heat had cleared the route more effectively than any ranger ever could. They began ascending. The cables require continuous pulling effort while stepping between wooden crossboards placed roughly every 10 feet on the granite slope. Under normal conditions, this is physically demanding. In a heat wave with the cable surface exceeding 140 degrees Fahrenheit, every grip becomes a burn. The granite under their feet was hot enough to feel through boot soles. The angle is steep enough that without the cables, the face would not be safely climbable without technical equipment. The drop on either side falls away across hundreds of feet of steep granite terrain. Experienced Half Dome hikers describe the cable section as the most exposed terrain they have ever been on, and most of them complete it under ideal conditions, with fresh legs, full hydration, and cool metal under their hands. Gretchen started up first, wrapping her hands around the cable and immediately pulling back. The steel was searing. She pulled her shirt sleeves over her palms and gripped through the fabric, pulling herself from crossboard to crossboard. The difference was that every trail she had ever attempted was something her body could actually do. Tammy followed roughly 10 feet behind, doing the same thing with her sleeves, but her shirt was thinner and the heat penetrated almost immediately.
I keep picturing that. Using your shirt as a glove on 140-degree steel. Honestly, that says everything about how far past rational thinking she already was.
Tammy's pace slowed dramatically within the first 50 feet. She was stopping at every crossboard, her breathing shallow and rapid, and her skin had shifted from sweating heavily to completely dry, flushed a deep, blotchy red and hot to the touch, which is one of the most dangerous signs of heat stroke progression. She had stopped sweating entirely. When your body stops producing sweat in extreme heat, it basically means the cooling system has completely failed, and that's the line between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Once you cross it, things move very fast. She told Gretchen she felt dizzy and that the rock was spinning. Gretchen told her they were almost there. They were not almost there, not even close. They were still roughly 350 feet from the summit, with the steepest section still ahead. Tammy kept going because Gretchen told her to. The same dynamic that had basically governed their friendship for 18 months was now playing out on a 150-degree granite face with no shade, no water, and no way to cool down. At approximately 3:35 p.m., roughly 200 feet above the base of the cables, Tammy stopped moving. She was gripping the cable with both hands, but her body had gone rigid and her eyes were unfocused. Gretchen, roughly 15 feet above her, called down to her repeatedly. Tammy did not respond. Her legs began to buckle and she slumped sideways against the cable, her body weight catching between the cable and a crossboard. She was still technically upright, but only because the cable infrastructure was holding her there. Gretchen descended to Tammy's position. Tammy's skin was completely dry, burning hot to the touch, and had turned a deep, mottled red. Her breathing was rapid and erratic, and she was not responding to her name or to physical contact. These are basically the textbook signs of severe heat stroke, when the body's core temperature goes past 104 degrees and the brain starts shutting down systems to try to protect itself. The confusion, the loss of coordination, the dry burning skin, it's all the body saying it genuinely cannot cool itself anymore, and without intervention, the organs start failing within minutes. Gretchen tried to get Tammy to drink from what little water remained. Tammy could not swallow. Her muscles were cramping and jerking involuntarily against the cable.
I've sat with this part for a long time, and the thing that genuinely keeps me up is Gretchen had to make a choice on those cables. Stay with Tammy, who was dying in front of her, or leave her and try to go get help, and she chose to go.
Probably because she thought if she could just reach someone, Tammy would be okay. She genuinely thought there was still time, and I keep thinking about how she never saw Tammy conscious again after she let go of that cable. Gretchen spent roughly 10 minutes with Tammy before she began descending for help. She left Tammy propped between the cable and crossboard and began moving down the cables. Gretchen had been on the mountain for nearly 6 hours in extreme heat, with effectively no water for the last 4. Her hands were blistered from the hot cables. Her own body was in severe dehydration. She made it to the base of the cables and began the sub-dome scramble down. The granite slabs had been in direct sunlight all afternoon, hot enough to sear exposed skin on contact. Her coordination was failing, her vision narrowing, her steps uncertain on terrain that required precise foot placement. Approximately halfway down the sub-dome scramble, Gretchen lost her footing and collapsed on the exposed granite. A hiker, ascending from below, found her sprawled on the rock, unresponsive, with burns already forming on her exposed arms and the side of her face from the heated surface. He poured his remaining water over her head and neck and began shouting for help.
I honestly don't think Gretchen even understood she was dying. I think she genuinely believed she was going to get help and come back for Tammy, and that makes this so much worse for me.
Park rangers reached Gretchen on the sub-dome within 25 minutes. She was briefly conscious and told them she had left her friend on the cables, that she believed Tammy had passed out and needed a helicopter, and she lost consciousness shortly after. She was airlifted to a regional hospital. Her core body temperature at the time of evacuation was measured at 107.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Organ failure had already begun. Gretchen Landis did not survive transport. She was 49 years old. A rescue team reached Tammy on the cables approximately 40 minutes after Gretchen's collapse was reported. Tammy was unresponsive and had no detectable pulse. She was pronounced dead on the cable route. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be heat stroke based on the condition of her organs and the circumstances of exposure. Tammy Salcedo was 47 years old. No permits, no water, no gear, every warning dismissed. They bypassed the checkpoint and started the cables at 3:15 p.m. on metal baking for nearly 10 hours with nothing left to drink. The ranger at the Subdome had turned back 6 groups that afternoon. In 8 seasons, it was the first time a bypass ended in fatalities on his watch. That ranger is the one I honestly feel for the most because he did everything right and the 2 people who ignored him are the ones who died, and he gets to live with that.
Both of them died on that mountain. Tammy on the cables and Gretchen in a helicopter. And I genuinely believe that if either of them had been hiking alone, they would have turned around at Nevada Fall or at the Subdome.
Or maybe even at any of the dozen exits the trail gave them. But together they built this dynamic where the person making the decisions had no idea what she was doing, and the person who knew something was wrong couldn't say it loud enough, and in extreme heat with no water. That is what killed them both. Gretchen's last post was from Nevada Fall. Shortly after noon, 340 likes, a caption about conquering fears. The account is still public. Tammy was 47. She didn't want to be on Half Dome. She was there because her friend told her she could do it, and she believed her friend more than her own body. Gretchen was 49. She believed it too. The mountain didn't kill them. The heat didn't kill them. The same voice that had been telling Tammy to keep going for 18 months told her to keep going one more time, and this time there was nowhere left to go. It was the 19th of July, 2017. The Grand Canyon cuts through the high desert of northern Arizona, dropping more than a mile from rim to river across layered rock that has been building heat since sunrise. The South Kaibab Trail descends 4,800 feet over 7 miles with no water sources, no shade to speak of, and no easy way out once you are committed to the bottom. In July, temperatures at the canyon floor regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That day was no different. At the center of the group was 3-year-old Melissa Collins. A fitness instructor by profession, she approached challenges with the same mindset she brought to training: commit fully and keep moving forward. People around her tended to follow that energy. Lauren Morgan, 35, brought the most experience in hot weather hiking. She had completed desert hikes before and felt comfortable operating in harsh conditions. That experience gave her confidence, sometimes more confidence than caution. If anyone was responsible for the details, it was Samantha Brooks. At 29, the physical therapist was usually the person reviewing maps, checking routes, and researching what could go wrong before a trip. Then there was Kayla Mitchell. At 27, she was the newest member of the group and the least experienced in this kind of environment. A former competitive swimmer, she was strong, determined, and eager to prove she belonged alongside the others.
That made her less likely to voice concerns when things became difficult.
They brought different strengths to the trip, and that likely made the plan feel more solid than it actually was. The 4 women had met through fitness communities and trained together regularly. Over time, they built a genuine trust in one another's abilities. That trust would later make it easier to keep moving forward, even when some of them had reasons to stop. The Grand Canyon had been on Melissa's list for years. She had mentioned it enough times that it eventually became a group plan. Lauren liked the idea of something with real stakes. Samantha started researching it the same week it was decided. For Kayla, being included was enough of a reason to go. As usual, Samantha did the deepest research of the group. She worked through route guides, safety information, and accounts from hikers who had completed the trail before. The details varied, but the warnings were remarkably consistent. Carry plenty of water, avoid the hottest part of the day, respect the heat. One thing that kept appearing was how unforgiving the inner canyon could be during the summer months. Temperatures near the river were often far higher than temperatures at the rim, and the South Kaibab Trail offered no water along the route. Everything they needed would have to be carried from the start. She brought those concerns to the group. The group met a few days before the trip to finalize everything. Samantha laid out what she had found: the water requirements, the lack of water sources on South Kaibab, the heat warnings, and the repeated advice about avoiding the canyon during the hottest part of the day. She wasn't trying to change anyone's mind. She was doing what she always did, making sure the group had the information. What they settled on was 2 liters per person, 8 liters total, for 4 people covering 14 miles round trip in July heat. The math felt reasonable when they wrote it down.
But there was a big difference between reading about the canyon and spending an entire day inside it.
The ranger who would see them the following morning would later describe it as less than half of what the conditions required. Lauren understood the warnings, but she wasn't particularly worried by them. She had hiked in hot conditions before and felt confident she knew how to handle the heat. In her view, many of the stories Samantha had found involved people who arrived unprepared or underestimated the canyon. That wasn't how she saw this group. Melissa felt much the same way. They had trained for the hike, studied the route, and planned everything in advance.
The goal was challenging, but it didn't feel unreasonable.
Samantha wasn't fully convinced, but she also knew nobody was seriously considering changing the plan. Lauren had an answer for every concern that came up, and when she spoke with that kind of confidence, the rest of the group usually followed. That was just how it worked. Kayla said very little. She was still the newest member of the group and had less experience in this kind of environment than the others. Most of the discussion was happening around her, and she didn't push back. By the end of the meeting, the plan remained largely unchanged. They would carry what they had calculated. They would start early. They would move efficiently. The warnings existed. They had seen them. The group simply believed they were prepared enough to avoid the problems those warnings described. They had planned an early start, which meant arriving at the south rim before the day began heating up. That part went according to plan. When the women reached the trailhead, the air was still cool and much of the canyon below remained in shadow. The temperature hovered in the low 70s. Looking out across the landscape, it was difficult to imagine that conditions near the river would be dramatically different just a few hours later. The women checked their gear one final time. Water bottles were full, food was packed, nothing appeared to be missing. Samantha briefly looked over the amount of water they were carrying. The numbers were close to what she had calculated during planning, and there was little point revisiting a discussion the group had already had. Everything was ready. A few minutes later, the four women made their way to the trailhead. A ranger was stationed near the South Kaibab trailhead that morning, which was not unusual. In July, rangers were often assigned to the busiest trailheads, because summer was when heat-related emergencies became most common. He took a quick look at the group and the gear they were carrying before asking about their plans for the day. The women explained that they intended to hike all the way down to the Colorado River and return to the rim before evening. He then asked how much water they were carrying. The amount immediately stood out to him. Think about the math for a moment. 4 people, a full day in the canyon, temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything they would drink for the entire hike had to be carried from the rim. For 4 people attempting a full river and back hike on South Kaibab in July, he did not think it was enough. The trail offered no water along the route, and temperatures near the bottom would climb well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. Over the years, he had seen strong, capable hikers get into serious trouble under similar conditions. Lauren wasn't particularly concerned. She had hiked in hot conditions before and felt confident she knew how to manage the heat. Staying hydrated, pacing yourself, and taking breaks when necessary were all things she was familiar with. The ranger understood that. What concerned him was that the Grand Canyon in July was not simply another hot weather hike. The combination of extreme temperatures, continuous exertion, and limited opportunities to recover was what made it dangerous, even for experienced hikers. Based on the conditions and the route they planned to take, the ranger believed each person should have been carrying roughly 4 to 6 liters of water. He said the return climb would take 2 to 3 times longer than the descent. He said most of the people he had seen get into serious trouble that summer had also felt prepared. The group acknowledged the warning but continued with their plan. The ranger watched them start down the South Kaibab trail and noted the time.
I just know it wasn't the first conversation like that he had had that summer.
The first part of the hike was genuinely beautiful. The early morning air was cool enough to make the exertion feel good rather than punishing. The trail dropped steadily through layers of red and orange rock, each switchback opening up wider views of the canyon below. Making good time, and the physical effort felt exactly like what they had trained for.
I think one of the reasons so many people underestimate the Grand Canyon is that the descent feels manageable. The scenery is incredible, the morning temperatures are comfortable, and every step seems to reinforce the idea that everything is going according to plan.
The women passed other early hikers along the trail, stopped occasionally for photographs, and checked their progress against the schedule they had built before the trip. They were slightly ahead of pace. Kayla was keeping up easily, which mattered to her more than she let on. On the steeper switchbacks, she stayed close to Lauren, matching her pace step for step. At one point, Lauren glanced back and told her she was moving well. Kayla said she felt good. She did, at that point. She wanted to keep feeling that way. Samantha continued keeping track of their water consumption. They were already drinking a little more than expected, which wasn't entirely surprising.
They must not have realized just how quickly the dry air and steady exertion were pushing them through their water supply.
She noticed it, but didn't make much of it. The descent was taking less effort than anyone had anticipated, but the conditions were already demanding more from them than the plan had accounted for. Every water break seemed reasonable on its own, and there was little reason for anyone to view them as a problem at the time. At that point, there wasn't much reason to. Much of the canyon was still in shadow, and the worst heat of the day had yet to arrive. By the time the women reached the bottom and the trail leveled out toward the river, they had been hiking for just under 3 hours. It was shortly after 9 in the morning. The temperature was already 95 degrees Fahrenheit and still climbing. Reaching the Colorado River often feels like a reward. After 3 hours of descending through exposed rock, the river marks the end of a long downhill effort. The sound of moving water, the brief relief of standing near it, and the feeling of having reached the bottom of something enormous all combine into a sense of accomplishment. The 4 women stood at the river's edge, and it probably felt exactly that way. Kayla took photographs. The timestamp on her phone would later place them at the river at 9:14 that morning. The group rested briefly. They ate, they drank water. Then Samantha checked how much water they had left. They had already used more than the plan had assumed. What remained now had to get 4 people back up 4,800 feet in what was going to be the hottest part of the day.
How that was going to work probably seemed like a problem for later.
Lauren was already focused on the return. They had made good time on the descent. The climb would be harder, but they were still feeling strong. The goal was to gain as much elevation as possible before the worst heat of the day arrived. Nobody suggested waiting until later in the day to begin the climb. At 9:22 that morning, the 4 women turned around and started back up.
The difference between going down and coming back up on South Kaibab is not something you can fully appreciate until you're in it.
Going down, gravity is working with you. The trail feels manageable, the pace feels sustainable, and the effort feels proportionate to what you trained for. Coming back up, everything reverses. Every step is work. The elevation gain that felt effortless on the descent now has to be earned back foot by foot, switchback by switchback, in air that is getting hotter by the minute. By 10:30 that morning, the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The canyon walls, which had been in shadow on the way down, were now fully exposed to the sun and beginning to radiate heat back toward the trail. On South Kaibab, there is very little shade. For long stretches, hikers are exposed directly to the sun, with few opportunities to escape it. The women were sweating heavily. Rest stops that hadn't been necessary on the descent were becoming necessary now. Water consumption was increasing in a way that was becoming harder to ignore.
The climb was still manageable, but the margin they had started the day with was beginning to shrink.
They still had thousands of feet to gain, the hottest part of the day was still ahead of them, and every mile upward required more water than the one before it. The rim was still thousands of feet above them, and the worst heat of the day hadn't arrived yet. Kayla was the first to show signs that the heat was becoming a serious problem. Around 11 that morning, roughly a mile and a half into the climb, she began falling behind the others in a way that was noticeably different from normal fatigue. She complained of a headache and appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Despite the heat, she also reported feeling cold at times.
Those are the kinds of symptoms that can accompany heat exhaustion.
At first, nothing about the situation seemed especially dramatic. The group had been hiking for hours, the temperature was climbing rapidly, and everyone was feeling the effects of the canyon. Kayla continued moving, but her pace was beginning to slow. The others noticed it as well. They adjusted their pace slightly and stayed together as they continued up the trail.
Looking back, this feels like one of those moments that's easy to recognize only after the fact, because the signs were there, they just didn't yet look like the beginning of an emergency.
Every step was something to push through, and she did. As the climb continued, the distance between the women became harder to maintain. The gaps would widen, then narrow again, whenever the group slowed to regroup before continuing upward.
It was a subtle change, but it reflected how much more difficult the trail had become compared to earlier in the day.
There was a point on the climb, roughly 2 miles above the river, where the situation was becoming difficult to ignore. The women had been in the canyon for more than 4 hours. The temperature was approaching 105 degrees Fahrenheit and still rising. Their water supply was shrinking faster than expected. Kayla was visibly struggling, and the rim remained more than 2 miles and roughly 3,000 feet above them. At that point, the hardest part of the hike was still ahead. The group had now been in the canyon for several hours. The river was far below them. The rim was still far above them, and the amount of ground they had already covered was beginning to rival the amount that remained. Earlier in the day, turning around would have been a simple decision. By this stage, every option involved hours of additional exposure to the heat.
And looking at the numbers now, it's hard not to wonder how they were supposed to get 4 people back to the rim on what they had left. But That's the benefit of hindsight.
At the time, they were still moving. The trail was still in front of them. And from where they stood, continuing upward probably seemed like the most practical option. So they kept climbing. Lauren was still setting the pace, still counting switchbacks, still measuring distance against time. It was the only way she knew how to move through something hard, break it into parts small enough to manage. Melissa had stopped talking. In the morning, she had been the one keeping energy in the group, calling out landmarks, checking on the others. By early afternoon, that had gone quiet. She was using everything she had just to keep her feet moving. Lauren was still setting the pace, but the effort was becoming harder to hide. Earlier in the day, she had been measuring progress by distance and elevation. Now, most of her attention appeared focused on maintaining a steady climb. Samantha was still watching, still tracking. The water was gone and the numbers no longer worked, and she knew it, had probably known it for a while. There was nothing left to calculate. There was only the trail. Kayla stopped looking up. Somewhere in the late morning, she had decided that looking at how far remained was making it harder. She kept her eyes on the few feet of trail directly in front of her and put one foot in front of the other. That was all she could do. So that's what she did. By noon, the canyon was a different place entirely. The trail had become noticeably quieter. Most hikers who intended to be on the route that day had either started much earlier or were already off the most exposed sections. Encounters with other people became increasingly infrequent as the afternoon progressed. The temperature had climbed past 108 degrees Fahrenheit. The rock surrounding the trail had been absorbing heat for hours, and there was little relief from the sun. The women had been hiking for most of the day, much of it in exposed terrain. They were all feeling the effects now. Headaches, nausea, heavy legs. Rest stops were becoming more frequent, and each one lasted a little longer than the one before it. Their water supply was nearly exhausted. Heat exhaustion doesn't announce itself cleanly. It builds gradually, often looking like ordinary fatigue, until the symptoms become difficult to ignore. By early afternoon, all 4 women were showing signs of it. The symptoms had moved past discomfort into something more specific. The sweating that had soaked through their clothing all morning was becoming inconsistent. Muscle cramps were layering on top of the fatigue rather than easing with rest. The headaches that had started as background noise were now making it hard to think clearly. The climb was becoming slower. Progress that had felt steady earlier in the day was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Kayla appeared to be struggling the most. She had become noticeably quieter, and most of her energy seemed to be going into the climb itself. The distance between her and the others would widen, then narrow again whenever the group slowed to regroup. But by this point, the problem was no longer just Kayla. The heat was affecting all 4 women. Lauren remained focused on the rim. When the group talked, the conversation often returned to distance, elevation, and how much farther they still had to go. Samantha had become quieter as the day wore on. Melissa was dealing with the same exhaustion and dehydration as everyone else while trying to keep the group moving.
At some point, the situation stopped looking like one person having a difficult day. It became a group problem.
There is a line between heat exhaustion and heat stroke that is easy to miss from the inside and much easier to recognize afterward. Heat exhaustion means the body is struggling but still trying to cool itself. Heat stroke begins when that cooling system starts to fail. Core temperature rises. The brain becomes affected. The body's normal warning signals become less reliable. By early afternoon, Kayla appeared to be deteriorating more rapidly than the others. What had started as headaches, fatigue, and nausea was becoming something more serious. She was struggling to maintain a steady pace and seemed increasingly confused. The climb, difficult enough under normal circumstances, was becoming harder with every passing minute. And she wasn't the only one suffering from the conditions. The women had been in the canyon for hours. The temperature had climbed to roughly 110 degrees Fahrenheit. There was nothing left to drink, and no way down that wasn't also a way further from help.
By then, the situation stopped being about determination. It became a medical emergency.
Areas protected from direct sunlight had become increasingly rare as the afternoon wore on, and most offered only brief respite before the route opened back into the heat again. By the time the women reached the overhang, it was one of the few places along that section where they could stop without standing fully exposed. The trail eventually brought them to the only relief available on that stretch of South Kaibab, a small rock overhang that offered a narrow strip of shade. They stopped there. By that point, continuing the climb was becoming increasingly unrealistic. The group had spent most of the day in extreme heat, and the effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Reaching the rim still meant covering a significant distance uphill with no water and no practical way to cool themselves. A few hikers passed through the area during the afternoon. The trail was far quieter than it had been that morning. Most people familiar with summer conditions in the canyon had either started much earlier or avoided the hottest part of the day altogether. The women remained where they were. The conditions around them offered little relief. The air temperature remained dangerously high, and the rock surrounding the trail had been absorbing heat for hours. Even in the shade, there was no meaningful way to escape the temperature. As the afternoon continued, their physical condition appears to have worsened. Investigators later concluded that all 4 women were suffering from severe heat illness by this stage. Without water, cooling, or rapid evacuation, the situation offered very little opportunity for recovery. The progression was not dramatic. It was physiological. The human body can only tolerate so much heat before critical systems begin to fail. Once heat stroke develops, survival often depends on immediate cooling and medical treatment. Neither was available where the women were stranded. One by one, the effects became overwhelming. The women eventually lost the ability to continue the climb. At some point later that afternoon, all 4 succumbed to the same conditions that had been building throughout the day: severe dehydration, prolonged heat exposure, and heat stroke. The temperature remained above 105 degrees Fahrenheit well into the evening. The women had expected to complete the hike that same day. When they failed to return and could not be reached afterward, concern quickly grew. The following morning, their vehicle was found still parked at the South Rim trailhead, and a search was launched. Searchers focused on the South Kaibab Trail and the surrounding sections of the canyon. The women were located later that day in an exposed area below the rim, near a small rock overhang where they had apparently stopped during the hottest part of the afternoon. Investigators recovered photographs and location data from the women's devices, which helped reconstruct the timeline of the hike. The record showed when they reached the Colorado River, when they began the return climb, and approximately how long they continued upward before they stopped making progress. Their water containers were empty when they were found. No evidence suggested a medical emergency unrelated to the heat, and no evidence indicated that any of the women had become separated from the group during the final stages of the hike. All 4 deaths were ruled the result of heat stroke brought on by severe dehydration and prolonged exposure to extreme heat. It was Friday, the 14th of June, 2019. A day that started the same way hundreds of other days at the Grand Canyon start, with headlamps, water bottles, and people convincing themselves that today was going to go exactly as planned. Her name was Dana Schulman, 31 years old, from Phoenix, Arizona. She worked at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, sat at a desk most of the week, and had only started hiking a few months earlier. It began as a casual way to lose weight and clear her head short loops at South Mountain Park near her apartment, then a few well-traveled trails in the Superstitions on weekends. She had bought real hiking shoes and a day pack. She had downloaded AllTrails and Google Maps. She was not a thrill seeker. She was the kind of person who read reviews before booking a restaurant and kept her car registration current. Her coworkers described her as organized and thorough, the type who sent meeting agendas the day before. But she had never done anything like the Grand Canyon. For over a year, she had wanted to see the Colorado River from inside the canyon after being inspired by striking photos online. When a long holiday weekend gave her 4 free days, she decided it was finally time to make the trip and experience the river firsthand. She prepared. Sort of. She read a few blog posts about the South Kaibab Trail, mostly first-person accounts that focused on the views. She watched a YouTube video shot in the spring, when the temperatures were mild, and the hiker in the video made the climb back up look hard but doable. She spent an evening on Google Maps tracing the route down to the river and back. She planned her start time to beat the worst of the heat. She told a friend where she was going and when she expected to be back. By the time she packed her bag the night before, she had done what most casual beginners would consider a thorough job of getting ready. Now, knowing how it ended, I realized the issue wasn't a lack of effort, it was actually inexperience. She lacked the knowledge to recognize the danger that she was facing. The forecast for that Friday was not ambiguous. Temperatures on the rim were expected to reach the low 90s. On the canyon floor, near the river corridor, it was going to be close to 112 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. The National Park Service had been issuing heat advisories. Their guidance was specific. Do not hike below the rim between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. during peak summer heat. The warnings were on signs, on the park website, on kiosks at the trailhead. They were not hidden. Dana knew it was going to be hot. Her calculation was that she would start before sunrise, reach the river quickly, take photos, and return to the rim before the temperature peaked. She believed she was physically capable of, that she was young and reasonably fit, but she had no real understanding of how elevation gain affects the body. She had never hiked more than 6 miles in a day. She had never climbed more than 1,500 feet in a single stretch. South Kaibab would demand nearly 5,000 feet of ascent on the way out. She assumed there would be shade in the lower canyon. She assumed there would be water access along the way. Both of those assumptions were wrong.
And in my view, they became two of the most consequential mistakes she made that day.
She arrived at the South Kaibab trailhead before sunrise around 4:45 a.m. The parking area was already active. This is normal for a summer Friday at the Grand Canyon. Other hikers moved around in the pre-dawn dark with headlamps, checking pack straps, filling water bottles at the station near the trailhead kiosk. The air was cool, maybe 65 degrees. There was a light breeze. It felt like a perfect morning. Rangers were stationed at the trailhead, as they regularly are during high heat periods. They were speaking with visitors, handing out printed heat advisory cards, and pointing people toward the water stations. A whiteboard near the trailhead listed the expected high temperature in the inner canyon, 112 degrees Fahrenheit. The warnings were visible and spoken aloud. A couple from Colorado later told investigators they had a brief conversation with Dana near the trailhead. They were preparing for a shorter out-and-back hike, and she approached them to ask whether South Kaibab was the fastest route down to the river. They confirmed it was. They also told her that the climb back out was brutal, long, fully exposed, with no water sources anywhere on the trail. She nodded. She seemed excited, maybe a little nervous. She thanked them and moved on. The woman from Colorado later recalled thinking that Dana's pack looked small, but she didn't say anything. A fellow hiker later told investigators her pack appeared unusually light for a river hike and estimated she was carrying only a limited water supply, though he chose not to intervene. Dana's gear consisted of a day pack, about 3 liters of water, energy bars, a phone, and a backup battery. She carried no electrolyte supplements, emergency locator beacon, or paper map, relying instead on a screenshot of the trail map stored on her phone. She was wearing trail running shoes sufficient for the maintained trail and lightweight synthetic pants. She had a hat and sunglasses. She looked like someone who had watched a few YouTube videos and bought gear at REI. She was not the worst prepared person to ever start down South Kaibab, but she was far from the best. South Kaibab is one of the most dramatic trails in the American National Park System. It drops approximately 4,800 feet, over roughly 7 miles to the Colorado River, and it accomplishes most of that drop in the open. There are almost no trees on South Kaibab. There is almost no shade. It is a series of exposed switchbacks carved into the canyon wall, and on a clear summer morning, the views from those switchbacks are the kind that make you stop walking entirely just to look. The sunrise was hitting the canyon walls in horizontal layers of orange and pink and deep red as Dana made her way down, and she was taking photos frequently. That's documented. Her friend later provided text messages sent from the trail that morning, and the tone was unmistakably joyful. She texted that the place was unreal, that she was already way deeper than she had expected. She noted that the trail was steeper than she had imagined, a comment that almost every first-time South Kaibab hiker would recognize. She passed hikers who were already on their way back up, experienced canyon hikers who had started their climb out before dawn to beat the heat.
I've even read several witness accounts of people mentioning the heat to her.
One woman, a seasoned backpacker from Flagstaff, told her directly that she should consider turning around before 10 a.m. The exchange was brief and friendly. Dana was polite, but she felt good. Her heart rate was elevated but manageable. Her legs were responding well. The river was pulling her forward with that particular magnetism that the bottom of the Grand Canyon seems to generate.
If you're a hiker like me, that feeling of physical competence is real, and it's also one of the canyon's most effective traps.
The descent is rewarding in a way that sedates your risk-sensing instincts. You feel good, so you assume things will continue to feel good. But your body has been spending energy and water the entire time, and none of that gets paid back on the way down. It all comes due on the climb. She reached the river corridor, the area adjacent to the Colorado River at the canyon floor, around 9 a.m. She sent another message to her friend. "Made it! Not as hard as everyone said." Her friend responded, "Be careful coming back. Heat is no joke." That exchange, timestamped and later recovered from her friend's phone, placed Dana at the river after roughly 4 hours of descent. She had covered nearly 7 miles and dropped close to a mile in elevation. She took photographs near the water. The river was there, exactly as she had imagined it. Narrow, muddy brown in the summer light, with canyon walls rising thousands of feet into the sky on every side. She still had about 2 liters of water left she had drunk, only 1 liter on the descent.
That was her first serious mistake. In dry heat, you should be drinking constantly, not waiting for thirst.
By the time you feel thirsty, you're already behind. She didn't know that. She sat on a rock, ate half an energy bar, and pulled out her phone. The temperature was already climbing past 90 degrees at the river. It was going to get much worse. The plan, as she had conceived it back in Phoenix, was simple. Rest at the river for 20 minutes, then start the climb back out. Stick to South Kaibab. Stay on the trail. That plan was going to be hard. It was going to require real effort in genuine heat, but it was executable.
People complete that exact route every day throughout the summer. I've even done it myself.
Instead, she opened the hiking app on her phone, a popular trail finding app that works offline with downloaded maps. Weeks earlier, while planning the trip, she had saved a pin for a viewpoint called O'Neill Butte. The photos online showed a dramatic overlook of the canyon's inner gorge. From the river, the app showed a trail, a thin blue line that appeared to connect to that viewpoint via a short side route. The distance on screen looked manageable, maybe half a mile. What Dana did not know, and what the app did not communicate, was that the blue line represented a combination of a legitimate NPS trail for the first few hundred yards, and then a faint, unmaintained use path that faded into loose rock and dead-end drainages. The app did not distinguish between maintained trails and social trails. On a 5-inch phone screen, with the sun already bright, the difference looked like nothing at all. She made a calculation that many beginners make. I came all this way. I'm right here. It's just a few more minutes. She sent a text to her friend, going to check out a viewpoint real quick, then heading up. Her friend replied, "Don't go off trail. Please just start climbing out." Dana did not respond. A backpacker in the area had the last confirmed encounter with her. He was filtering water near the river and noticed a young woman standing at the edge of a dry wash, staring at her phone with a concentrated frown. He approached and asked if she needed help finding the main trail. She told him she was looking for a route to O'Neill Butte. He told her he didn't think there was a direct trail from here, that she'd need to go back up South Kaibab and take a different tralu. She thanked him, but seemed unconvinced. She turned and started walking up a side drainage. He watched her for a moment, considered following, then decided she was an adult. He went back to filtering water. No one saw Dana Schulman again after that.
Now, I should note that everything from this point forward was reconstructed by investigators.
They worked from her phone's GPS data, her text messages and their timestamps, location pings from her carrier's network, and the 911 call. What follows is their best reconstruction of what happened. Where the evidence is direct, I'll say so. Where investigators and experts are drawing conclusions from physical evidence, I'll say that too. She kept moving after the backpacker left. The GPS data shows continued movement away from the main corridor, heading east-northeast into terrain that does not appear on any National Park Service map as a maintained route. The temperature was climbing past 100 degrees by 11 a.m. In the inner canyon away from the river, with no breeze and the sun angling down between the walls, the air does not just warm up, it accumulates heat. The rock walls absorb it all morning and begin releasing it back. Standing anywhere in that environment without shade is the physiological equivalent of sitting in a parked car with the windows up. She texted her friend around 11:30 a.m. The trail got weird. Not sure I'm going the right way. That message, timestamped and recovered later, is one of the more significant pieces of evidence in the investigation because it marks the moment when she recognized something was wrong but hadn't yet escalated it to an emergency. Her friend reading that text in Phoenix replied immediately, "Go back to the main trail. Do not keep going. Turn around." Dana's response was, "I think I'm almost there."
That response, measured against the GPS data from that same time window, is very likely incorrect.
Investigators believe she was already moving away from any maintained trail and further into unmapped terrain. The viewpoint she was trying to reach was not close. It was over a mile away, across a series of small ridges and dry washes. The route she was on was not the one she thought she was on. But from where she was standing, looking at her phone, with the blue line showing a destination just ahead, it probably felt like she was nearly done. Most of us have been in a version of that situation, slightly lost, but confident we're about to figure it out. The difference between that experience in a city park and that experience in the inner Grand Canyon in June is the difference between inconvenience and a survival situation. She was burning water her body could not replace. The electrolytes she hadn't packed were already a deficit her muscles were starting to feel. And every step she took was a step taken in the hottest part of one of the hottest places in North America. The terrain Dana was moving through, reconstructed from the GPS track, was consistent with the landscape that exists just off the maintained corridors in the inner canyon. It is not dramatic in the way that canyon terrain is usually described. No sheer cliffs, no technical climbing. It is subtler and in some ways worse. Loose rock underfoot that shifts when you step on it. Dry washes that look exactly like trails but lead to dead ends or down into side drainages that have no clear exit. Small canyon branches that appear to be going in the right direction until they aren't. Junctions that aren't junctions. Paths that fade into nothing. Her phone's offline maps operating in this environment were showing her lines that carried the visual authority of real routes. In reality, investigators believed those lines represented either faint use paths worn by occasional off-trail travel, or, in some cases, simply the algorithm's inference of possible connectivity between 2 points. The app was doing what it was designed to do. It just wasn't designed for the Grand Canyon Inner Canyon in June with a dehydrated hiker making decisions under advancing heat illness. Her texts became less frequent and shorter. The one that stands out arrived around 12:45 p.m. This doesn't look right. Those 4 words are the clearest signal in the written record that she understood she had made a mistake. Her friend, who had been growing increasingly anxious, began calling. The calls went to voicemail. Whether she couldn't hear them over the terrain, or whether the signal was too weak to connect consistently, or whether she was already in a condition where answering a call felt impossible, the records don't definitively say. What the GPS data does show is that during the period following that last text, her movement became erratic in a very specific way. Short bursts of movement in one direction, then a stop, then movement in a different direction, then backtracking over ground she had already covered. This is the GPS signature of someone who is lost and trying to reorient, moving towards something that looks promising, discovering it isn't, reversing, trying again. Investigators estimated she spent over an hour in this pattern from roughly 1 p.m. to 2:15 p.m. Every minute of that hour was a minute spent in temperatures that had reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit in full exposure, with her water running dangerously low and no shade available. The physical cost of that hour was compounding in ways that would very shortly take the decision-making out of her hands entirely. By mid-afternoon, around 2 p.m., the Inner Canyon temperatures were near their daily peak of 112 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun was as high as it gets, which meant the canyon walls cast almost no shadow at that hour. The rock's surface temperature, the actual temperature of the ground she was walking on, was substantially higher than the air temperature above it, likely exceeding 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Dana had been on her feet and moving for nearly 10 hours. Heat illness doesn't announce itself clearly. It builds in stages, and the cruelest part of how it works is that by the time it begins affecting your judgment, you are no longer reliably able to recognize that your judgment is affected. Medical experts who consulted on the investigation described the likely progression in detail, and it's important because it explains what the phone data shows during this period. In the early stages, the body does everything right, sweating heavily to cool itself, increasing heart rate to circulate blood, directing resources to the muscles.
To me, that's the dangerous part. These symptoms feel like normal hard exercise fatigue, the kind most active people would simply push through.
Then comes the transition into heat exhaustion, muscle cramping as electrolytes are depleted, a headache that builds behind the eyes, dizziness when standing, a growing sense of mental fog. These are warning signs. They are also easy to misread as ordinary fatigue when you believe you are almost to safety. The stage beyond that heat stroke is where the brain itself is affected. The internal temperature regulation system begins to fail. Core body temperature rises past 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the brain cannot function normally. Confusion sets in, not as a vague sense of being off, but as a measurable deterioration in the ability to reason, make decisions, and assess situations accurately. People in this stage often believe they are fine. They often believe they are close to help.
They often believe that they're close to help. They often keep moving when the only correct action is to stop.
Dana's phone logs from this period show repeated opening of the map application dozens of times in quick succession, as if she was looking at the screen, not understanding what she was seeing, closing it and opening it again. The GPS pings show frequent stops. The movement patterns are consistent with someone struggling to process visual information. She sent one last text to her friend around 2:20 p.m. It said, "Tired, no shade." Her friend's response was immediate and urgent, telling her to sit down and that she would call 911. Dana did not reply. Her friend called Park Dispatch within 2 minutes. Based on the GPS position at that time and the topography of the area, investigators believe her assessment of no shade was accurate. In the terrain she was in, at that time of day, there was likely no meaningful shade available within any reasonable distance. The canyon walls were too low and too far away to cast shadows at that hour. She kept moving slowly, erratically. Investigators believe she continued because she was still convinced that safety was just ahead of her, a trail, a ranger, a water source. That belief, in her physiological state at that point, was most likely a product of the confusion that comes with advancing heat illness rather than any clear-eyed assessment of her situation. The canyon looks similar in many directions.
Looking at the terrain, I can understand how someone in her condition might believe that the next ridge was the last obstacle standing between her and help.
Her water was gone. Both 5-liter bottles were empty. She had stopped sweating, a critical sign of severe dehydration and impending heat stroke. The call came in at 2:37 p.m. The dispatcher who took it noted the caller's voice immediately strained, labored, breathing audible and fast in a way that wasn't consistent with normal exertion. There was a quality to the speech that experienced dispatchers recognized, words that came out slightly slower than they should have, a flatness that indicated someone operating at the outer edge of their cognitive capacity. The dispatcher moved through the standard questions: name, location, how much water she had left, any landmarks she could see, physical symptoms. Dana answered all of them, but the answers were problematic. Her name came through clearly. Her location did not. She said she could see canyon walls, which was true of every point in the Grand Canyon. She believed the river was somewhere behind her, but based on the GPS data recovered from her phone, that belief was incorrect. She had wandered nearly a mile from the river corridor. When the dispatcher asked which direction she had come from, she said uphill, which was not specific enough to be useful. The dispatcher asked her to open her phone's emergency GPS sharing feature. Dana tried, but the connection was too slow to complete the handshake. The dispatcher attempted to ping her phone from the dispatch center's system, but the canyon walls degraded the signal to the point that the returned coordinates had an error radius of nearly 1,000 feet, the difference between one drainage and the next. The dispatcher made the call quickly. This person was suffering from serious heat illness and did not know her precise location. That combination, in that environment, was a search and rescue situation. The instructions came clearly and directly. Stop moving, find any shade, even partial shade, a shadow from a rock outcropping, anything. Sit down and stay down. Do not use energy trying to hike out. Conserving what her body had left was the only thing she could do that would help the people who were already being mobilized to find her.
But get this, the call didn't end there. It continued for nearly 9 minutes. What happened over those 9 minutes was a slow unwinding.
Her speech got slower. The pauses between sentences stretched from 2 seconds to 5 seconds to 10 seconds. The dispatcher asked questions and waited longer for answers. At one point, Dana said that she sees a rock, a big rock, and that she was going to sit on it. Then there was a long pause. The call ended at 2:46 p.m. Whether the connection dropped on its own or whether she let the phone fall from her hand, the evidence doesn't say. No further data was received from her device. The final GPS ping placed her in a small side canyon approximately 1.2 miles east of the South Kaibab Trail corridor at an elevation of roughly 2,400 feet. Rangers launched the search within minutes of the 911 call.
Now, you might assume that once a search begins, help is on the way.
But what you have to remember is that the same brutal heat affecting the missing hiker is also affecting the people trying to find them. Searchers operating in 112-degree heat have their own physiological limits. Helicopter operations in extreme heat are affected by air density, requiring longer takeoff rolls and reducing lift capacity. Ground teams moving through rough canyon terrain in full sun face the same radiant heat environment the missing person is in. Search teams from the rim, river corridor, and air mobilized quickly, using phone pings, witness accounts, GPS data, and terrain analysis to narrow down her likely location. Overnight, helicopters with thermal imaging and ground crews continued searching, and at 5:42 a.m. on June 15, searchers found her empty backpack in a dry wash and located her body about 200 feet away beneath a rock overhang. The autopsy confirmed severe heat stroke and dehydration with extreme electrolyte loss, leading to rhabdomyolysis and organ failure. There were no traumatic injuries. The coroner estimated she died between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., several hours after her 911 call, after exhausting her water supply in the canyon's extreme conditions.
I want you to think about that for a moment. Hours alone in the heat, growing weaker, increasingly confused, and knowing that help hadn't arrived.
The Grand Canyon was unchanged by what happened to Dana Schulman. The South Kaibab Trail remained open the following morning. The canyon is not a trap. It is a place with real conditions, and those conditions don't bend for anyone.
The only thing that changes the outcome is understanding, before you start, exactly what you're walking into, and what you'll need to walk back out.
It was the 9th of July, 2018, and the South Kaibab trailhead on the Grand Canyon's south rim was already filling with hikers by 6 a.m. The South Kaibab Trail is one of the most spectacular and most dangerous day hiking routes in the national park system. Unlike the nearby Bright Angel Trail, South Kaibab has no water anywhere along its length. No pipe stations, no creek, nothing. It also has almost no shade. What makes the canyon so deceptive is that it is upside down compared to a mountain. On a mountain, the hard part comes first. You climb when you are fresh and descend when you are tired, and the summit is a natural turnaround that forces a decision. The canyon reverses all of that. The easy part, the descent, comes first, when you are fresh and the air is cool. The hard part, the climb, comes last, when you are tired, dehydrated, and the day has heated up. There is no summit to force a turnaround, just an endless invitation to go a little deeper. Everything about the experience is built, almost perfectly, to lure people past the point they can safely return from. Rangers understand this. Most first-time visitors do not. The park lives with the consequences of that gap every summer. Rangers and volunteers patrol the upper sections of these trails, specifically to catch people heading down unprepared, turning back hikers who have too little water, too little time, or too little understanding of what the heat will do to them. They hand out warnings, they ask pointed questions, they have talked countless people out of a hike that would have hurt them. But they cannot be everywhere, and they cannot stop someone who looks fit, moves well, and gives every appearance of knowing exactly what they are doing. The people who slip through are very often the ones who least look like they need stopping. Renee Calloway was 38 years old and lived in Denver. She was a competitive amateur trail runner who had completed multiple ultramarathons, including 2 50-mile mountain races, and who routinely logged 15 to 20-mile training runs through the foothills and high country around the Front Range. She was lean, exceptionally fit, and accustomed to a body that did whatever she asked of it. Friends described her as someone who treated difficult terrain as a kind of conversation, something to engage with rather than fear. She had run high mountain trails in brutal cold and thin air. She had pushed through the kind of fatigue in races that sends most people to medical tents. Her fitness was not a hobby. It was central to who she was. She had spent 15 years building that capability. She ran 6 days a week. She tracked her heart rate, her sleep, her recovery. She had a coach for her race seasons and a circle of running friends who treated long suffering on a trail as a form of fun. In the world she lived in, the body was a tool you sharpened, and discomfort was just information you learned to push past. That worldview had served her well across hundreds of races and training runs in the mountains of Colorado, where the danger was altitude and cold and the occasional storm, all things she understood and respected. What she did not have was any real experience with heat. Denver summers are warm but dry and mild compared to the desert Southwest, and her training was done at altitude where temperatures stay moderate. She had never trained in genuine extreme heat, had never felt what 110 degrees does to a working body, and had no instinct for how fast and how completely heat can take a person apart. Her mental model of difficulty was built entirely around cold, altitude, distance, and fatigue, the dangers she knew. The desert had a different one waiting for her, and it was not on her radar at all. She was at the Grand Canyon for a short solo trip, a few days of driving and sightseeing between races. She had no major hike planned. The canyon was a stop, not a destination. I'll be honest, she wasn't careless, she was capable. But sometimes the canyon punishes capable far harder than it punishes careless. On the morning of July 9th, she drove to the canyon and rode the shuttle bus out to the South Kaibab trailhead, which sits on a stretch of road closed to private vehicles, intending to do something small. Her plan, as later reconstructed from her messages and the account of a person who saw her at the trailhead, was to walk down to the first overlook, a popular spot called Ooh-Ah Point that sits less than a mile down the trail, take in the view, take a few photos, and walk back up. A 40-minute outing at most. Something to stretch her legs and see the canyon up close before getting back in the car. The night before, she had texted a friend that she might do a quick sunrise walk at the canyon before driving on. Nothing serious, just to see it properly. That was the entire scope of the plan, in her own words. A quick walk, nothing serious. For a woman who considered a 20-mile mountain run a normal Tuesday, a stroll to a viewpoint less than a mile away did not register as an activity that required preparation of any kind. Because that was the plan, she brought nothing. No water, no pack, no food. She had her phone, sunglasses, and a light long-sleeve layer tied around her waist. She was dressed for a casual morning, not for the canyon. To her, bringing water for a 40-minute walk to a viewpoint would have seemed almost absurd, the same way you wouldn't fill a hydration pack to walk to your mailbox. The problem was that the Grand Canyon is not a neighborhood, and the trail she was about to step onto does not behave like a walk to a viewpoint. no matter how short the first stretch of it feels.
I genuinely can't wrap my head around someone carrying a phone but no water into the Grand Canyon in July.
A person at the trailhead thought they remembered her days later, when investigators were asking around. While most hikers nearby were adjusting loaded packs and hydration bladders, this woman, as they recalled it, had walked past the warning signs with nothing in her hands but a phone. Memory at a crowded trailhead is a fragile thing, and the account was never something anyone could fully confirm, but it fit the one detail that was not in question, that when she was found, there was no water container on her, or anywhere near her. Put together, the picture was of a woman who had walked into the canyon with nothing to drink, though exactly how that choice got made, no one would ever really know. The warning signs at the South Kaibab trailhead are not subtle. They show a graphic of a strong young person and state directly that people exactly like that die in the canyon from heat, that going down is optional, but coming up is mandatory, and that hikers should not attempt to go too far. Renee, by every account, walked past them without slowing down. They were written for someone else, someone less capable, someone who needed the warning. That was the assumption anyway.
I've stood at trailheads like that at dawn. It's cool and breezy, and I promise your body has no idea what's actually coming.
The early morning descent was effortless. For a trained ultra runner, walking downhill on a well-graded trail in cool morning air is barely exercise. Renee reached Oo-Ah Point in roughly 15 minutes. The view was extraordinary, the canyon opening up in layers of red and gold in the early light. She took her photos, and then, instead of turning around, she kept going.
I've made this exact mistake on a fun downhill, telling myself just one more bend, and that instinct is the deadly one here.
This is the part of the canyon that gets people, and it has nothing to do with fitness. The descent feels wonderful. Every step down reveals a new view, a deeper layer, a more dramatic perspective. The next landmark always feels close. There is a psychological pull to a descending trail that is genuinely hard to resist, a sense that the real reward is always just a little further down, around the next bend, past the next ridge. For someone whose entire life had trained her to keep going when her body felt good, the pull was almost irresistible. Her body felt good, better than good.
Now this is the exact spot where I'd have grabbed her arm or something, because a sensible plan dies down here, one pretty view at a time.
Renee continued down to Cedar Ridge, a flat saddle about 1.5 miles in and 1,100 feet down, a common turnaround point with a pit toilet but no water. She felt strong. She felt better than strong. She felt like she was barely working. Cedar Ridge is where a lot of sensible day hikers stop, take in the view, and head back up, and even that climb sends plenty of them back to the rim tired. Renee barely paused, so she kept going. The canyon changed character as she dropped. The vegetation thinned. The walls rose higher on either side, throwing the morning into sharp lines of light and shadow. The air, so pleasant at the rim, grew noticeably warmer with every few hundred feet of descent, the way it does when you walk down into a basin that traps heat. She was descending into a different climate entirely, one layer of rock at a time, and the cool morning she had started in was being left behind above her with every switchback. None of it felt alarming. It felt like progress, like the reward for going a little further, which is exactly how the canyon draws people down.
The way I see it, every step down a canyon is like a loan, and South Kaibab collects the whole thing on the way back up.
Below Cedar Ridge, the trail steepens and the exposure increases. Renee continued down to Skeleton Point, 3 miles in and about 2,000 feet below the rim. Skeleton Point is the spot where the trail offers its first full view of the Colorado River far below, and it is the absolute maximum that the Park Service suggests for a summer day hike, with heavy warnings even then. By the time she reached it, the sun had climbed well above the canyon walls, and the temperature was rising fast. It was approaching 9 a.m. The cool morning was gone. Skeleton Point is where the trail finally reveals the Colorado River, a thin green ribbon impossibly far below, and it is genuinely one of the great views in the American Southwest. It is also, for a summer day hiker, a finish line disguised as a waypoint. The park asks people to treat it as the absolute turnaround, and for good reason. Everything beyond it is steeper, hotter, and further from help. Renee stood at that view with 2,000 feet of climbing already banked beneath her, feeling strong enough to think the river itself might be reasonable. It was not reasonable. It was never reasonable. But nothing in her body was telling her that yet. She had now descended 2,000 feet on no water in steadily increasing heat, and she felt, by every internal signal her body was sending, completely fine. This is the trap precisely. A person of Renee's fitness could descend another 1,000 feet and still feel capable. Her cardiovascular system was so efficient and her pain tolerance so high that the early warnings most people feel, the heaviness, the thirst, the small voice that says turn around, either weren't registering yet or were easy to dismiss. Her body had spent 15 years learning to ignore exactly those signals. That training, which made her a great athlete, had effectively disabled the alarm system that the canyon was depending on to send her back. A normal hiker arrives at Skeleton Point already tired, already thirsty, already aware that the climb back is going to be miserable, and that awareness is protective. It makes them turn around. Renee arrived at Skeleton Point feeling fresh. And feeling fresh at the deepest point most people are willing to go is not a sign of safety. It is a sign that you have the capacity to get into far more trouble than the average person, and no internal brake to stop you.
I want to just yell it at the screen. Feeling great that deep in a waterless canyon isn't safety, it's the danger just being set even more.
Renee continued past Skeleton Point. Exactly how far she went is something investigators could only estimate from her photos and the handful of points where people thought they saw her, but the best reconstruction had her descending toward the area approaching the tip-off, roughly 4.5 miles in and around 3,000 feet below the rim. Somewhere in this stretch, the heat finally reached her. The temperature this far down by mid-morning was likely well above 100 degrees. She had been moving for close to 3 hours with no water, and the first real symptoms arrived: a headache, a dryness she couldn't ignore, the first flicker of doubt.
She turned around because she might have thought that at that point, turning around meant she was safe, and I wish that were true, but this is the moment the real fight starts.
The problem was that turning around at 3,000 feet down is not the solution it feels like. It is the beginning of the hardest and most dangerous part. She now had to climb 3,000 vertical feet in fully exposed terrain, in rapidly intensifying heat, with no water and a body that had already started its slide. To put that climb in perspective, 3,000 feet of vertical gain is comparable to climbing the stairs of a 200-story building, except the stairs are uneven rock, the air is over 100 degrees, the sun is directly overhead with no shade, and there is no water at the top of any flight. The ascent is where the canyon does its real work. Climbing is metabolically expensive, it generates enormous internal heat, and that heat has to be shed through sweat. Sweating requires water. Renee had none. Within the first few hundred feet of climbing, her pace, which had been so effortless going down, collapsed. She was stopping frequently, seeking the thin slivers of shade thrown by the occasional rock outcrop, her heart rate climbing, her head pounding. The same trail that had felt like a gift on the way down had become a furnace she had to fight through step by step.
I can't stress this enough. You don't tough out a core temperature. No one has ever taught her that. You can't tough that kind of thing out. It's not possible.
I can't stress this enough. You do not tough out a core temperature, and nobody had ever once taught her that. For the first time in maybe her entire athletic life, Renee was encountering a situation that effort could not solve. In a race, when things get hard, you dig deeper, you push, you summon the will to keep going, and that works because the limiting factor is usually your own discomfort tolerance. In the canyon, the limiting factor was water and core temperature, and no amount of will produces water or sheds heat. Her single greatest asset, the ability to push her body past where other people quit, was useless here. And worse than useless, because it kept her moving and generating heat when stopping might have bought her time. The deterioration was not dramatic from the outside, which is part of what makes heat illness so insidious. There was no single moment of collapse, just a steady erosion. Her steps got shorter, her rest stops got longer and closer together. The headache that had started as a dull pressure became something she could feel behind her eyes. She was sweating less than she should have been, which she might have read as relief if she had known anything about heat, when in fact it is one of the worst signs there is. Her body was running low on the water it needed to keep cooling itself, and it was starting to make hard decisions about where to send what little remained. She would climb a short stretch, then stop, hands on her knees, waiting for a heart rate that would not come down the way it always had. The shade she chased kept getting smaller and farther apart as the sun climbed higher, until there was barely any shade left at all. Her mouth had gone past thirst into something drier and more frightening. Her thinking, when she tried to plan, kept sliding off the task. The simple math of how far she had to go and how long it would take refusing to add up in her head. She was still moving, still pointed uphill, still doing the one thing her whole life had taught her to do, which was to keep going. It was the wrong thing, and there was no longer any part of her clear enough to know it. There is a specific cruelty to the way the inner canyon holds heat. The rock absorbs the sun all morning and then radiates it back, so that by the middle of the day, a hiker is being cooked from above by direct sun and from below and beside by stone that has turned into a kind of oven. Ground level temperatures on an exposed trail can run well above whatever the official forecast number says. For a body already low on water and fighting to cool itself, that extra load is enormous. Renee was climbing through the hottest hours of the day into the hottest part of the canyon, and every foot of elevation she gained was also a foot deeper into the conditions the rangers warn about most. The math of it was simple and merciless. She was making heat faster than she could shed it, She had no water to spend on cooling, and the rock around her was pouring still more heat into the equation. There was only one way that equation ever resolves, and the canyon was already solving it.
Heat does not negotiate. It doesn't care in the slightest how many miles a person has run in their life.
On a trail as busy as South Kaibab, plenty of people passed her that morning, and working out afterward who had actually seen her, and when, was never clean. The account investigators leaned on most came from a man who had been descending with his teenage son. Somewhere in the late morning, he said, he passed a woman sitting on a rock in a patch of shade, flushed and breathing hard. He asked if she was okay. She told him she was fine, just resting, that she'd gone further than she meant to. He offered her water, and as he remembered it, she hesitated, took a few swallows from his bottle, then waved off more, saying he'd need it and that she was almost back up anyway. If it was her, and the details fit, she was not almost back up. She was over 2,000 feet below the rim. He said she sounded normal, maybe a little embarrassed about having gone too far, the way a capable person sounds when they have slightly miscalculated and don't want to make it a thing. There was no slurring, no obvious confusion, nothing that screamed emergency. That is part of what makes these situations so hard for the people who cross paths with them. By the time someone is visibly, unmistakably in crisis from heat, they are often already past the point where a few swallows of water and good intentions can save them. Renee was in that in-between zone, where she still seemed like a fit adult who had simply overdone it, and she presented herself that way because in her own mind, that is exactly what was happening.
It wrecks me that she waved off more water just to be polite here. A few swallows was never gonna save her.
The man said he had no reason at the time to think she was in serious danger. He and his son continued down. He told investigators later that he thought about her for a long time afterward. The heat in the canyon kept climbing toward its midday peak, and Renee kept climbing into it. The symptoms she was now feeling marking the progression of heat exhaustion toward heat stroke, the most dangerous heat-related condition there is. Her body, unable to cool itself without water, was losing the fight to regulate its core temperature. The headache intensified, nausea set in, her coordination began to slip. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke exist on a continuum, and the line between them is where it becomes life-threatening. In heat exhaustion, the body is struggling but still managing, sweating heavily, the person weak and nauseated but mentally present. Heat stroke is when the cooling system fails entirely. The core temperature climbs past the point the body can tolerate, and as it does, the brain itself begins to be affected. Once core temperature passes roughly 104 degrees, organ damage begins, and the swelling that follows produces confusion, disorientation, and eventually unconsciousness.
What honestly scares me about heat stroke is that it steals your judgment at the exact moment that you need every bit of it.
As Renee's core temperature climbed, her ability to make rational decisions, to recognize how much trouble she was in, to ration her energy, or even think about calling for help was eroding. And her lifetime of pushing through discomfort, the exact trait that made her a successful ultra runner, was now telling her to keep going when keeping going was killing her. The internal voice that had carried her through 50-mile races, the one that said, "You can handle this, keep moving," was the worst possible advisor in this specific situation, and it was the loudest voice she had.
And it genuinely stings how every gift that made her great at racing turned into a liability the second that heat hit her.
This is the part that separates heat deaths from almost every other kind of trail accident. There was no fall, no broken bone, no sudden catastrophe she could react against. The thing killing Renee was invisible and internal, a number climbing inside her own body, and the only treatment was the one thing she did not have and could not reach. Shade slowed it down. Rest slowed it down. But without water, and without a way to truly cool her core, slowing it down only stretched out the time, it did not change the direction. By late morning, her phone showed no reliable signal in most of the inner canyon, and even if it had, the decline of advancing heat stroke makes a coherent call for help less and less likely.
Every ranger I've read says the same thing. The one who dies out here aren't necessarily the weak, they're the strong who ignore the warnings.
She climbed back up toward Skeleton Point through the late morning and into the worst heat of the day, slower and slower, gaining maybe 1,000 feet from her turnaround in conditions that were now brutal. Another pair of hikers thought they might have seen her later on, a woman off the side of the trail who did not seem to be moving much, though they could not be sure it was her and could not place the time beyond sometime before midday. They assumed, like everyone else, that she was just resting in the shade. The canyon was full of people resting in shade that morning. By the time anyone realized she was not resting, it was far too late. Somewhere just below Skeleton Point, Renee stopped for the last time. She moved off the trail into a thin band of shade beneath a rock outcrop, and there, alone, With no water and no way to cool down and no signal to call for help, her body finished what the heat had started. The sweating had already stopped. The cooling system was already gone. Her core temperature had climbed past the point a body can survive. And in that sliver of shade, roughly 2,000 feet below the rim, Renee Callaway died. Still 1,000 feet and several brutal hours short of the rim she had walked away from that morning, expecting to be back at by mid-morning.
I want her remembered for this. She clawed 1,000 feet back uphill with no water before her body quit. That's not weakness.
When she didn't turn up or answer her messages the next day, the friend she had texted about a sunrise walk grew worried and called the park. Her car was found in a lot near the rim, and once the scattered sightings were gathered up, searchers concentrated on South Kaibab and found her there. She had no water container on her or anywhere near her, and an autopsy by the medical examiner confirmed hyperthermia, no heart problem, and no hidden condition. Just a healthy and extremely fit 38-year-old woman killed by a walk she thought would take 40 minutes. Much of her last day had to be pieced together rather than known. From the photos, the few people who crossed her path, and the hard physical facts of where she lay, but the shape of what happened to her was never really in doubt. Renee came to the Grand Canyon as one of the fittest people on the trail that morning, and it changed nothing, because the canyon doesn't reward strength. It rewards respect, and nobody had ever taught her the difference. She walked down with no water because she was only going a little way, and then the canyon showed her one more view, and one more, until there was no version of the climb back her body could survive. She didn't die because she was weak. She died because she was strong in the one place on Earth where being strong was the most dangerous thing she could be. It was the 19th of July 2016. Half Dome rises 8,839 feet above sea level in Yosemite National Park, California. Reaching the summit and returning requires a hike of more than 14 miles, with nearly 4,800 feet of elevation gain along the way. The final stretch is the section most people recognize from photographs. Hikers must climb a steep granite face using 2 steel cables permanently anchored into the rock. There are no ropes or harnesses provided. By that point, reaching the summit depends entirely on a hiker's strength, balance, and whatever energy remains after the long climb to get there. Nevaeh Corin was 28 years old and lived in Sacramento, about 3 hours from the park. She worked as a dental hygienist at a small private practice and spent most of her free time outdoors. When the weather was good, she was usually on a trail somewhere, whether it was a day hike, a camping trip, or a long walk through the foothills near her apartment. She was not training for a major event or chasing personal records. She simply enjoyed being outside. Some hikes were with friends, while others were solo trips on familiar routes.
I've wondered if part of the appeal was the contrast, since her weekdays were spent indoors under bright lights and fixed schedules, while a trail offered space, quiet, and a chance to slow down.
Half Dome had been on her list for a while. Not in a vague, someday kind of way. She and her close friend Mara had actually talked about it seriously, looked up the permit system, read through trail guides. It had been a plan for about a year, something they kept almost doing and then not doing, which had turned into a bit of a joke between them. The summer of 2016 was the year they were actually going to follow through. The Half Dome permit lottery is competitive. It opens months in advance, spots fill within hours, and most people don't get through on the first try. Nevaeh applied and got 2 permits, both for July 19th. That felt like a sign. Then, about 3 weeks before the date, Mara's mother had a medical episode that required her to travel out of state. The trip was off for her. She told Nevaeh to go without her. "Don't let the permits expire," she said. Nevaeh went back and forth on it for a few days. The permits were date-specific. There was no moving them to a better weekend, no transferring them to someone else. It was July 19th, or it was nothing. She had done solo hikes before, nothing this long, but she knew how to read a trail and she felt prepared. She decided to go. In the 2 weeks leading up to the hike, she did 2 preparation hikes, one about 7 miles in the foothills east of Sacramento, and one closer to the Sierra Nevada, roughly 10 miles. Both went well. She bought a new pair of trail shoes a week out, and wore them on the second prep hike to break them in.
The night before she left, she packed her day pack, a 2-liter hydration bladder filled to capacity, 2 granola bars, a bag of trail mix, sunscreen, a light jacket, her phone, and her permit.
She didn't carry a water filter or extra bottles. She drove to Yosemite Valley that evening and checked into a campground inside the park. That night, the campground was loud. July in Yosemite is peak season. The place was nearly full, and groups at neighboring sites were still up late, talking, cooking, and letting their kids run between tents. For most of them, the next day would probably be a short walk to a viewpoint or an afternoon by the river. Nevaeh, meanwhile, was getting ready for one of the longest and most demanding hikes she had ever attempted.
Campgrounds have a way of making strangers feel like they're all sharing the same experience, even when they're there for completely different reasons.
A heat advisory had been issued for the region that evening, covering the central Sierra Nevada and the surrounding foothills. The warning appeared across weather apps, online alerts, and information boards throughout the park. Forecasts called for unusually high temperatures across the mountains the following day. Heat advisories are easy to associate with cities and valleys, but they matter in places like this too. Half Dome sits at high elevation, yet much of the route is exposed to direct sunlight, with long stretches offering little shade and no access to water. She was on the trail before 5:15 inches the morning. Before she left the campground, she sent Mara a text. It was short, something along the lines of, "Heading out now, wish you were here." Mara was in another state, dealing with her family. She didn't see the message until several hours later.
The trip they had talked about for months would ultimately become a story that Mara had to hear from someone else.
The trailhead parking lot was already partially full when she arrived. A few groups were gearing up in the dark headlamps clipped to packs, the quiet sound of zippers and boots on asphalt, someone going over a checklist in a low voice. Most of the people starting at that hour knew exactly what they were doing. Starting before sunrise on a summer day in Yosemite isn't just a preference, it's the difference between finishing in manageable heat and finishing in something else entirely. Nevaeh starting before 5:15 a.m. was the right call. By every early indicator, she was doing this correctly. The first section of the hike follows the Mist Trail, a steep, well-worn path that climbs past Vernal Fall through more than 600 stone steps cut directly into the granite. In the early morning, the trail is cool and partially shaded, and the spray from the falls drifts across the path in a fine mist that soaks your clothes and keeps the air noticeably cold. It's physically demanding even at that hour. The steps are uneven, slick in places, and they just keep going, but it's also the most forgiving stretch of the entire hike. There's water everywhere, the air is cool, your legs are fresh. Nevaeh moved through it steadily. She passed a couple coming down from an overnight camp. They mentioned it was going to be a hot one and that they were glad to be heading out early. She agreed and kept moving. By the time she cleared the upper falls and the trail leveled briefly before the next climb, she had been hiking for a little over 2 hours and felt strong. That part is important. She felt strong. The hike, up to that point, was going exactly the way it was supposed to go. She reached Nevada Fall, roughly 5.5 miles, in and around 5,900 feet of elevation, sometime around 740 inches the morning. She stopped for about 10 minutes, found a spot near the viewpoint, and ate half a granola bar while looking out over the falls. Nearby, a father and his teenage son were taking a break of their own, eating breakfast and studying a trail map spread across their laps. After a few minutes, they struck up a conversation and asked whether she was heading all the way to the summit. When she said she was, the father mentioned that he had completed the hike a few years earlier. According to him, the cables looked intimidating in photos, but they felt even steeper once you were actually standing on them.
At the time, it was just a brief conversation during a rest stop. Neither of them had any reason to think they'd be among the last people to see her doing well.
She took a photo before leaving the light still low and golden across the fall, the mist catching it. It was time-stamped. She was already roughly a third through her water. That's not alarming on its own. 2.5 hours of hiking, some of it steep. In warming air, a third of 2 liters is about what you'd expect. The problem wasn't what she had used. It was what she had left and how much trail was still ahead of her. That feeling at Nevada Fall, strong, ahead of schedule, comfortable, is worth paying attention to, because it doesn't just describe how she felt in that moment. It becomes the reference point she measures everything against for the rest of the hike. 2 hours later, when her legs are heavier and her head is starting to ache, the comparison isn't to some objective standard of how she should feel, it's to how good she felt at Nevada Fall. And compared to that, everything else just feels like normal fatigue, like the hike doing what hikes do. She left Nevada Fall and kept going. One thing no trail guide fully prepares you for is what the heat on open granite actually feels like once you're in it. You can read about sun exposure and elevation and lack of shade, But the experience of standing on a pale rock face with heat coming from above and radiating back from below is something that only registers when you're already there. The trail above Nevada Fall moves through a stretch of forest before the trees begin to thin. It happens gradually, the pines spacing out, the undergrowth pulling back, patches of open granite appearing between the trees, and then at some point the last of the shade just ends. The trail opens onto wide granite slabs and the sky takes over. No canopy, no shadow, nothing between you and the sun. The air temperature had already climbed well past 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the rock was radiating heat from below to match it. From up there, you can see for miles the valley floor far below, the surrounding peaks, the sheer scale of the landscape in every direction. It looks manageable from up there. The distances flatten out. The summit doesn't look far. That's not a comfort, it's a trick the terrain plays on you, and it works on almost everyone.
The dangerous thing about commitment is that it accumulates slowly, and by this point, turning around would have felt far more difficult than it sounds.
The first rest stop came somewhere on the open switchbacks. She stopped, hands on her knees, breathing steadier than her legs felt. Started again after a minute or two. A mild headache had settled in somewhere above her eyes, the kind that's easy to put down to squinting in bright light or the altitude or just the effort of the climb. She noted it and kept going. Somewhere further up the exact point, isn't clear she noticed the hydration bladder was lighter than she expected. Not close to empty, but lighter than it should have been for where she was on the trail. She had been drinking steadily without really tracking it, and the reservoir had dropped faster than her pace suggested it should. She was still a significant distance from the summit.
The calculation she would have made in that moment was probably something like this. I'm more than halfway there. I've been moving well. I can manage what's left. The kind of reasoning that makes sense when quitting feels worse than carrying on.
At some point on that stretch, she noticed the amount of water other hikers were carrying. Large bottles clipped to backpacks, hydration reservoirs with tubes running across their chests, extra supplies tucked into side pockets. Early in a hike, details like that barely register. But here's the thing, when your own supply is running low, trust me, it's hard not to compare what you're carrying to what everyone else has. The second rest stop came not long after. She stopped again, this time sitting briefly on a flat section of rock. The headache was still there, slightly more present than before, sitting behind her eyes rather than above them. She drank the last meaningful amount of water she had and stood back up. The trail ahead was still exposed, still climbing, still offering nothing in the way of relief. Around mid-morning, she reached a flat section of trail a little over a mile below the subdome. A group of 3 hikers heading down passed her. They had already been up to the cables and knew how hot the upper trail had become. One of them slowed when he saw her sitting on a rock in the sun, shoulders slumped, a nearly empty water bottle resting in her lap. He asked if she was doing okay. Nevaeh said she was just taking a break. The hiker mentioned that temperatures were climbing quickly and that there was still a fair amount of trail ahead. She thanked him, rested for another minute, then got back on her feet and continued upward. The trail between that point and the subdome doesn't give you anything. No shade, no water, no flat ground, just a steady upward grind across open granite with the heat coming from above and reflecting back from below. Other hikers were still visible ahead and behind, which made continuing feel like the normal thing to do. When the people around you are still moving upward, stopping feels like the unusual choice. You calibrate your sense of what's acceptable based on what everyone else is doing. Nobody around her was turning back. By the time she reached the base of the subdome, she had been hiking for more than 5 hours. Temperatures had climbed into the low 90s, and her water supply was nearly gone. At most, she had a few small mouthfuls left. The summit was closer than it had ever been. She kept going. This part made me wonder, did it still feel like a challenge at that point? Or had she already shifted into that stubborn mindset where the only thing that mattered was reaching the end? Sometime around 10:30 inches the morning, she began climbing the subdome steps. If the trail up to that point had been hard, the subdome was something different. It's roughly 600 feet of near vertical exposed granite, steep enough that there are fixed handrails bolted into the rock, steep enough that you're using your hands as much as your legs. In reasonable conditions, with water and energy, it's demanding, but manageable.
But let me tell you, in low 90s heat, after 5 hours of climbing with almost nothing left to drink, each step up those stairs takes a little more out of you.
She was moving slowly, one hand on the railing, pausing every few steps to let her breathing settle. At the top of the subdome, just before the cables begin, there's a point where rangers or trail volunteers check permits before allowing hikers onto the face. Someone saw her there, looked at her face, checked her card, waved her through. A routine interaction, unremarkable, over in seconds. She continued to the cable base and sat down on the granite. She wasn't in shade. Over the next several minutes, she finished the last of her water, taking a few small sips until the hydration bladder was empty. Nearby, 2 hikers were preparing for the cables, adjusting gloves, and making final checks before beginning the climb. One of them noticed Nevaeh sitting on the granite, looking up toward the summit. She wasn't talking, she wasn't moving much, but neither of those things would have stood out in a place like this. Plenty of hikers stop at the base of the cables to rest and mentally prepare before heading up. The 2 hikers eventually began their ascent. Before she stood up, she took a photo pointing upward at the cables, the summit visible above them, the granite face in full midday sun. It was the last photo on her phone. Her permit was still clipped to the outside of her pack. She was out of water, but she started the cables anyway. Here's what the cables actually look like up close. 2 parallel steel cables anchored into the granite face, with wooden foot rungs bolted into the rock about every 10 feet. The angle averages around 45 degrees, but steepens in sections. You face the rock, grip both cables, and step upward rung by rung. Most hikers wear gloves. The cables and rungs have been in direct sun for hours by mid-morning, and the metal gets hot enough that bare hands become a problem on a long ascent. The east-facing granite was in full direct sun. There was no wind. Heat was coming from above, through the sun, from the rock face directly in front of her, and from the rungs and cables under her hands and feet. There was no direction that wasn't hot. If there's one thing this story reinforced for me, it's that heat doesn't need to feel dramatic to be dangerous. She moved slowly from the start. A solo hiker who began the cables a few minutes behind her kept a comfortable distance and watched her go one rung at a time, pausing between steps, movements deliberate but increasingly labored. He didn't think it was unusual. The cables are hard. The heat was obvious to everyone on the face. The summit was visible from the moment she started climbing. From the base, it looks achievable. As you get higher, it gets closer in a way that feels like progress even when your body is telling you something different. 2/3 of the way up, the top is roughly 120 feet away. That's closer than the base is. At that point, going up and going down are almost the same distance, except going up ends at the summit and going down ends where you already were. About 2/3 of the way up, somewhere around 260 to 280 feet above the base, she stopped. Both hands remained on the cable, but she wasn't climbing anymore. The hiker behind her waited for a moment, assuming she was just taking a break. After a while, he asked whether she wanted him to pass. There was no real response. She turned her head slightly in his direction, but otherwise stayed where she was. That's when he realized something wasn't right, and started climbing up to her. Her grip on the cable was loose, with her fingers curled around it more than actually holding it. Her face was deeply flushed, the redness extending from her cheeks down into her neck. What stood out most, though, was her skin. It was dry. Not damp, not sweaty, just dry, in the middle of a near vertical climb in 9 4-degree heat. When he asked her name, she answered, but slowly, with noticeable pauses, like she had to think about it before saying it. He asked if she had any water left. After a short pause, she said she was out.
Genuinely had a lot of respect for what he did next. He handed her what remained in his bottle. She took a few small drinks, less than half of what he offered.
When he told her they needed to get her down, she didn't object. But it quickly became clear that she wasn't moving normally anymore. Her legs still worked, but she seemed unable to coordinate what they were supposed to do. Every step had to be guided, almost like she was following instructions rather than making the movements herself. Getting someone in that condition down the cables was not a simple task. Descending meant facing the rock, stepping backward, and maintaining a grip on both cables at the same time. Even under normal circumstances, it could feel awkward. With someone who could no longer reliably direct their own movements, it became far more difficult. He positioned himself directly above Nevaeh, keeping one hand on the cable and the other near her shoulder while guiding her through each step. A woman who had been climbing behind them noticed what was happening, turned around, and began helping as well. She stayed below Nevaeh, helping guide her feet onto each wooden rung. For the next stretch of the descent, the 3 of them worked their way down the cables together. There was no specialized equipment and no real plan beyond getting her safely back to the bottom. They simply adapted to the situation in front of them, one careful step at a time. It took somewhere between 35 and 40 minutes to bring her from her position on the cables to the base of the subdome. Every minute of that descent, the sun was on all of them. By the time she reached the flat area at the bottom, she couldn't stand without support. She was lowered to the ground, her skin was hot and dry to the touch, her breathing was rapid and shallow. She was conscious, but not responding to most questions. The hiker who had been behind her on the cables managed to find a single bar of cell service. He placed a call shortly after noon, but it dropped before he could finish. He tried again. That call dropped too. A few minutes later, a third attempt finally connected. He reported an unresponsive woman near the base of the cables and gave the best description of their location that he could. A helicopter was sent from a facility roughly 40 miles away. Then there was nothing left to do but wait.
I've always thought that waiting might be the cruelest part of an emergency, knowing help is on the way, but having no idea whether it'll arrive soon or not soon enough.
The two hikers moved her to the only shade they could find, a shallow rock overhang barely wide enough to offer any meaningful relief. It blocked the direct sunlight, but the granite beneath her had been absorbing heat since morning and was still radiating it back into the air. They poured the little water they had left over her neck and forearms. At some point, another hiker stopped, took one look at the situation, and handed over a small bottle of water without being asked. It wasn't enough to change much, and everyone there probably understood that. More hikers passed through during the wait. Some stopped briefly to ask whether help was on the way before continuing down the trail. There wasn't much anyone could do. Nevaeh was no longer speaking. Her eyes occasionally followed movement, but she wasn't responding to her name. The two hikers who had brought her down the cables stayed beside her, doing what they could with the limited shade and water available.
Those two strangers could have continued their day, but instead they chose to share the burden of someone else's worst one.
The next 70 minutes would test the limits of what compassion alone could accomplish. The helicopter arrived and landed on a flat granite shelf about 200 feet from her position. Her core temperature, measured on scene, was 106.1 degrees Fahrenheit. She was carried to the aircraft on a litter. She did not regain consciousness during transport. Nevaeh Corin was pronounced dead that afternoon. Below, on the trail, the day continued. Other hikers were still on the cables, still coming up from the subdome, still making their way down from the summit. The helicopter would have been visible to some of them, a brief interruption in the sky above the dome. Most of them wouldn't have known what it was for. By the time the last hikers cleared the trail that evening, the only sign that anything had happened was a car still sitting in the trailhead parking lot after dark. The autopsy was completed 2 days later. The cause of death was exertional heat stroke. In plain terms, the body regulates its internal temperature through sweating. During prolonged exertion in extreme heat, if fluid loss outpaces intake, that system begins to fail. The body stops cooling itself, core temperature rises. Past a certain threshold, organs begin to sustain damage from the heat directly: the liver, the kidneys, eventually the brain. It doesn't happen suddenly. It builds over hours, quietly, while the person is still moving and still making decisions. The visible signs show up late. By the time someone looks obviously wrong, the process has usually been underway for a long time.
The autopsy revealed liver cell death and kidney damage consistent with severe heat stroke and prolonged physical exertion, while toxicology results were negative and no underlying medical conditions were identified.
Based on the time-stamped photos, the empty hydration bladder, and her recorded temperature at rescue, the medical examiner estimated she had likely crossed into the critical phase somewhere around the time she started the cables, possibly earlier, on the final stretch of the upper trail. The 70-minute wait for the helicopter was within normal parameters for that terrain and distance. It was also, by that point, almost certainly beyond the window where intervention would have changed what happened. Her belongings were collected and returned to her next of kin. Mara was notified that night. The case was closed as an accidental death.